not because you're regulating them to do that. And that's what I want to kind of talk about. And that's what basically much of the high road discussion is about. I should say, as we went around the table, Barbara Geyer mentioned that she's the director of something called the Good Companies, Good Jobs Strategy. I were, and Sloan more generally, just received a very large and generous grant from the Hitachi Foundation to pursue exactly this set of issues. And we now have, or either we now do, or we're about to have a big center that's focused precisely on this kind of set of high road issues. Second thing I want to get to in my unreadable slide here is to link the high road discussion to another discussion about which there's been a lot of literature on so-called high performance work organizations. So high performance work organizations is jargon for firms that engage in team production, job rotation, quality circles, all these kinds of practices. There's been the kind of canonical example of this, but it's not, the discussion is clearly not limited to that, is how the American automobile industry adopted Japanese, basically the Toyota system. Much of the research about these high-performance work systems came out of the MIT Automobile Project, initially showing that these systems lead to higher levels of quality and higher levels of productivity. The logical link between these high-performance work systems literature and the high road discussion is because if it's true that high-performance work systems lead to higher levels of productivity and higher levels of quality, that creates some margin, some space to share those benefits with the workforce and thus create high-quality jobs. But a couple complexities. The literature is also very unclear about whether that actually happens. That is to say, do firms that adopt team systems, that adopt quality systems, adopt job rotation, and so on, are workers really better off under those systems? In some cases, yes. In some cases, no. That is to say, in some cases, they become high-road firms, and in some cases, they don't. So the point being that the two concepts, while linked, are not synonymous. It's also true that there's additional complexities. You can adopt a high-performance work organization, and let go of your old workforce and hire a new workforce. So it's not so great for those folks who were there before. And finally, additional complexity, and this is kind of an extreme example, you could have a high-road gas station, right? You could have a gas station that pays the people who pump the gas good wages and treats them very well, but it's a high-performance work organization. It's a high-road job, but it's not a high-performance work organization. So the two concepts, there is a big literature, as I'll talk about, on high-performance work systems. And it's related to this high-road thing, but it's just not the same thing. And my only complaint here is, again, in a lot of the discussion, and I'm going to just complain a lot about how the kind of discussion around these issues have gone, a lot of the discussion isn't very sharp in making these kinds of distinctions. Okay. So the high road discussion itself. I think there's three key themes that need to be discussed, or three elements to the high road argument. One idea is it true that choice is possible, that firms could choose between the high road and the low road, or the middle road, or whatever you want to call it. Secondly, is the idea, because the alternative to choice is an alternative that is that work organization and so on is just driven by exogenous factors, technology being one that might be of interest to people in this room, or others, and there's no margin for choice. The second key kind of intellectual discussion, or key policy discussion, is the idea or the question about whether the high road is equally profitable as the low road, or whether it's less profitable, but firms should adopt it because it's the right thing to do. The literature, the discussion, the literature. When I say literature, I should asterisk. This kind of proceeds on two tracks out there. There is a big kind of there's a public policy discussion pushed often by advocates or by advocates of one kind or another. And then, and there's also kind of a smaller research literature on the topic. I'm kind of moving, I'm kind of lumping those two together because actually they both suffer from the same kinds of issues that I'm raising. So there's a question about profitability or the consequences to organizations of this. And then finally there's a question about diffusion and adoption. And these three questions, is choice possible? What are the consequences in terms of profitability? And what's the explanation for diffusion and adoption? Seem to me the big, unclear, unresolved, and open questions in this discussion. So first, is choice possible? This is a core assumption of the whole discussion, that in fact choice is possible, that firms have within limits a choice about how to organize work and can go in one direction or another. Now there is some research on this. There's an old tradition, a very old tradition of research on, for example, how do firms respond to technologies and how much choice is there in adoption. There's an old Marxist literature, which some of you may know, that was launched by a guy named Braverman, I don't know how many, 30, 40, 50 years ago. There's a literature, actually a very good book that I just reread by a former colleague of ours here at MIT named Bob Thomas, who did 3 case studies of the adoption of technology in different manufacturing and software settings. Other colleagues of ours here again at MIT, Frank Levy, David Outer, did a nice case study of adoption of different models of how banks responded to the same check processing technology. So there is a literature on the question of do firms have choice. I have to tell you that in my view, the literature hasn't been pushed. It's kind of with a few exceptions, kind of an old literature. No one's actually ever really kind of pulled it together and made a case as to what the core findings are and what the weaknesses are and what needs to be resolved. But there is that literature. There's also, and I'll talk about this in a second, particularly in the public policy discussion, but also actually, I'm sorry to say, in the academic discussion, I want us to be clear, I suffer from this as much as other people do.
The program is
kind of a reliance on existence proofs and examples. Oh, the Joe Schmo donut store selling donuts in a hippy-dippy way treats its workers great. This is an example of the fact that you can do it. There's a lot of that. Unfortunately, in fact, when I say there's a lot of it, there's a lot of use of these kind of idiosyncratic examples. They often tend to be the same idiosyncratic examples. Now, the existence proof stuff is important. So a good example of an existence proof argument is Zainab's work recently on high road retail. And this is important work because it shows that it's possible to do it. But it just simply begs a series of questions. These are all, and not just her stuff, this whole discussion. It's picking idiosyncratic cases, often with founders who had a set of values and it's not clear how to generalize. It's consistently a selection on success. So the cases are examples of places that did it and made it work. You have no idea from that literature how many places tried it and failed, or how many places didn't try it. And there's no theory in this kind of idiosyncratic existence proof style of argument, no theory of adoption, an answer to the core question, which is if it's so great, how come everyone isn't doing it? And so all this kind of stuff that I've just said, it seems to me, goes to the question of, this first question I'm giving you, which is choice possible? And I think for the reasons I've just laid out, there's a lot of work to be done on that question to make it, get to answers I think we should feel comfortable with. The next open question in the literature is, does it pay for firms to adopt it? That is to say, people who are interested in the high road, me included, want to make the argument that it's profitable. I mean, you're certainly not going to go to an organization and say you should do this, and you're going to lose money. So at the core of the argument is, it is in fact profitable for you to do it. That leads to the question of why they aren't doing it. I'll talk about that in a second. But, okay? But even here, leaving aside whether there's a research base for saying it's profitable, the discussion, I think, is unclear about two alternative versions of that assertion. One version is, it's equally profitable to what you're doing, but for a set of bureaucratic or informational reasons, you're not doing it. No one's told you, or it's hard to move your organization. You have an organization with a set of fixed interests, and, you know, but it would be equally profitable if you would do it. It's kind of like saying there's two equilibria, and you're in one equilibria. It's very hard to jump over to the other equilibria, but if you could make that jump, you could overcome the organizational inertia, you'd be equally well off, and your workers would be better off. That's kind of linked to this high performance work organization, because you know, if your workers are going to be better off, there's some cost to that maybe, but the higher levels of quality and satisfaction and productivity would pay for it. So that's one version of the profitability story. The other version of the profitability story is, well, it's not as profitable. You'd still make money, but not as much as you could, but you should be willing to take that bite because it's in the public interest or in the social interest that you take that bite. That's a different argument, and requires a different sell, even if it was, you know, even if you could prove it. My claim to you is that the discussion around all these issues is just not clear about that distinction between those two kinds of arguments. And regardless, the evidence on either is extraordinarily weak. I mean, really, really weak. There's some evidence out there that the high performance work organization systems, there's a lot of evidence actually, that the high performance work organization leads to higher levels of productivity and quality. That, I think, a lot of research has nailed down, including research by folks in this room, but lots of research by folks outside this room. But the issue of profitability and payoff, I think, is very, very unclear. And the discussion also doesn't make that distinction, as I said, between it's equally profitable and it's less profitable, but you should do it for other reasons. Okay. Finally, we come to the third big question, which is adoption. And there's been almost no research on the question of why do some firms adopt the high road and others don't. Now, there has been more systematic research on the adoption of high performance work systems and good managerial practices. So I did a very early paper. It's been exceedingly improved upon by other folks, much higher quality work than what I did, on what kinds of firms adopt good managerial practices or what kinds of firms adopt high performance work organizations, teams, and so on. You can critique that literature also on selection issues, but it's pretty solid. But on this other issue, which is what kinds of firms not just adopt these practices, but what kinds of firms choose the high road to share those benefits with your workforce, or what kinds of gas stations, even though they're not high performance work organizations, what kinds of gas stations treat their workers better and what don't. There's been very, very little research on that. Okay. So, I mean, there's been virtually no research on that. It's all this reliance on these idiosyncratic examples. So, and then of course there's this other question, which is kind of an embarrassment to the whole literature, which is sustainability. How many firms which adopt it in good times sustain it over the cycle? And, you know, the business school literature on this is kind of laughable. So if you looked at In Search of Excellence, right, that book that sold about 100,000 copies more than, or 100,000 times more than any book I've ever written or ever will write. It listed whatever, 15 great companies. Half of them are out of business and half of them are screwing their workforce. I mean, there's a real issue about sustainability. And so that question has not even been addressed yet in the literature. Okay, that's my complaint about adoption. Okay, finally we come to this issue of the policy menu for getting firms onto the high road. And I think the policy menu falls into kind of 4 or 5 different subcategories. One is the kind of what you could call a jawboning category. Make the case. Political leaders argue for this. Business associations have conferences. Academics have conferences and jawbone. So there's a jawbone.
Don't forget the president can tweet.
I'm sorry?
And also the president can now tweet.
Oh, God.
So that at our seminar, the Irish seminar last Tuesday, people started that conversation, and I had a temper tantrum. I can't. That's just not a topic we talk about. Okay, it's just for my mental health, if not anyone else's. We're not going to get it there. Okay, but you're right. So there's a jawboning argument. The jawboning argument, there's an implicit assumption to the jawboning argument, which is that it's a equally profitable thing to do. People just don't know about it. Or it's almost as profitable, and if we could just convince companies to kind of give up a little bit of those profits and do the right thing, we could teach them to do it. So that's the joke. Okay. There's an argument about changing the context in which firms operate, fixing financial markets, or changing the goals of corporate boards, or a skilled workforce. But the financial markets corporate board thing, it still has some built-in assumptions about is it more profitable, or equally profitable, slightly less profitable, because otherwise, markets are doing what they're supposed to be doing. There's a third kind of policy incentive, piece on the policy menu, which is power and regulation. I've already talked about that. Just beat the crap out of organizations and make them do it. Make them pay their workers better, make them fix their scheduling practices, and so on. I actually am very supportive of the fight for 15 and all this. I actually am. But I don't think it's going to be the answer to this. I think it's inherently a limited strategy, in part because firms have countervailing responses to that, which to some extent undermine that. And then the final one, the one I love, of course, is to understand on an industry by industry basis the incentive structure facing firms and operate on that incentive structure on a way that leads them to perceive it to be in their interest to improve quality of work. So to kind of illustrate that in kind of 2 minutes, I just finished a book on home health workers. And home health workers are people who are going to take care of me in a few years, give me a bath and so on. And they have to be paid a lot to put up with that. But even though you all would insist on an infinite pay for that, they don't get that. They get, on average, nationally, about $9 an hour for that. So the question is, how do you make those into good jobs? What's the high road? And so I studied that industry in some depth, and I tried to understand who the players were, that is to say, who the firms were, for example, the home health agencies. I tried to understand who the players were, insurance companies, state Medicaid officials, and advocates. And I tried to understand the incentive structure facing employers. And more importantly, in this case, the incentive structure facing payers. Now, I tried to make the argument in this book that you can make the case that it's going to be in the interest of payers, of insurance companies, to make these into better jobs. Because if you make them into better jobs and pay people better and train them better, these home health workers, you can then, in this particular case, cut back on their utilization of more expensive healthcare providers, such as nurses. And so instead of paying a home health aide $9 an hour to do X and paying a nurse $45 or $50 an hour to do X, you train the home health worker and pay them $18, and you don't use as many nurses. You might think, how could I write a whole book on that obvious point? But I did. That's why I have a high road job. I can get away with that. So that's an example, a capsulated example of, in a particular industry, what I think is the right strategy to follow, which is to understand the incentive structure facing the players in that industry, and understand how to tweak that incentive structure in a way that makes it in their interests to do this kind of thing. But that's the policy menu. So the one thing that none of this deals with, and I recognize that, is everything I've said is about how you take a particular industry or firm and get them to improve the quality of their jobs. I haven't said anything about the other kind of big labor market challenge, which is what if someone wants to move from industry A to industry B, and that's the way they can improve the quality of their life. And that does raise a whole set of other policy issues, partly human capital, partly labor market matching questions, and so on. And that's something I've personally done a lot of work on in my career, and I have a lot to say about, but it's not really part of this discussion. So, in conclusion, I would say that I do believe that kind of finding ways to incentivize and push organizations in this high road direction is the right thing to be thinking about. But I also want to tell you that I think the kind of discussion about it is very, very underdeveloped, and there's just a lot of open questions, and people who are kind of advocates make assertions which are just assertions, and that's all they really are. Okay, I've kind of, I hope, provided you kind of a framework for thinking about this, and now think about it. We're open for conversation. Yeah.
I see Eric's got about 35 questions. I want to get mine in before he starts. Two questions, not necessarily related. Every year, the local publications put out a list of the best places in Massachusetts to work. And the items that they look at are direction, execution, connection, management, work, pay, benefits. What are your thoughts on those types of lists, apropos of your commentary here? And with respect to sustainability, isn't it impossible to find anything that has sustainability in dynamic industries and marketplaces? I mean, when I was in business school, we looked at the People's Express case study as a good example of how the company in that particular industry created more interested, active employees and had greater profit. That doesn't work today for airlines. So two unrelated questions.
Sure.
I'm going to get them in.
So, I mean, a glib kind of playing for laughs response to the question about that list is, how do we feel about business school rankings lists? There's just a lot of bullshit in all these things. That said, if you were looking for kind of a research, a way of doing research on this topic, you might turn to a list like that for looking for a sample of high road firms. I think you'd have to, frankly, pay a lot more attention than I've paid, or I think anyone has paid, the newspapers that publish those lists have paid, to what's underlying them and what the quality of the data are and how the data are weighted and all that stuff. But I wouldn't dismiss it, I'd look at it. Okay. On the airline example, yes, People's Express, Southwest Air has done a long time, including up till now, been a high road airline. I'm not claiming that organizations won't go out of business, nor am I claiming that they won't change in their size. But the question about sustainability is not whether you stay in business or even whether you grow or contract. It's how you treat your existing workforce. And so that's the issue. And so the issue is is it possible to be consistent in that, even as you move into different markets or as you grow or as you shrink. Yeah.
I'm just curious about if you have numbers about the companies that remain private or take themselves private for the very, very reason you have, because they're not pressured to have to
Yeah.
share your portfolio value. They
Sure.
say they want to pay their employees more, they want to treat
Yeah.
them well, but they're constantly pushed into areas that are
Well,
not good for them or good for the employees.
So of course the data, I mean, I'm not an expert on the kind of,
I'm just wondering.
the databases on this, but too many of these idiosyncratic examples are in fact examples of companies that are not subject to stock market pressure, or private companies, including big companies. I mean, I teach a case on SAS, the software company.
Yes.
You've probably all taken that case one place or another. SAS is privately held, and Jim Goodnight has a vision that he imposes on his company. Happens to be a good vision, but it's not subject to stock market pressure. So I think there is an issue about, there's a big issue about the role of finance in this. But remember, if these systems, if the high road was equally profitable, truly was equally profitable, then finance shouldn't be a problem. So the argument that there's something wrong about firms being exposed to the stock market, Barbara's going to say, oh, the short run, but let me just tell you, you have to assume all of our MBAs going into finance are idiots if they can't make the distinction between short run and long run. I mean, if in fact these systems were equally profitable or more profitable, then why would finance be an obstacle? Yeah.
Well, just speaking on that question, Jeremy Stein does have a model where everyone's rational, and still people are overly short-term focused because of informational issues. They don't know whether this high road strategy is legit or is it somebody hand waving, and so then they go for short-term indicators. So anyway, but that's not what I wanted to get. I just a comment and then a question. Comment is on the choice point. A framework I find very useful, and you sort of indirectly allude to, is the whole complementarities literature, which there's lots of evidence that there are complementarities among different systems. Catherine Shaw, Paul Milgram, and I have done some stuff. There's been a bunch of papers I did empirically where you get different systems that fit together. Some might involve one cluster and another cluster, and that would be well, empirically, there's lots of evidence that there are these clusters, and that can certainly support the idea that there's choice, and you may get
Absolutely
stuck in an equilibrium that isn't the
Yeah.
most profitable one.
Yeah.
But you have to make changes on multiple dimensions simultaneously, and that can be difficult.
Yeah, so that's I guess because I was just trying to talk fast and short. That's what I view as part of the high performance work organizational literature. And
Yeah.
the idea of complementarities, I think, was first raised, I could be wrong, by John Paul McDuffie in his early work. He referred to it as bundles. He used that vocabulary, bundles, not complementarities. Complementarities is more of an economist way of talking about it. I think that's right. The high performance work organization literature strongly suggests that you can't just introduce training that you need to introduce these bundles. But it doesn't suggest that the workforce has to share in the benefits. And that's
No, which gets to my second point, which is more of a question. So the main framework people think about this in the economics literature is sort of a more neoclassical framework, and it's not at odds with what you're saying, but emphasizes different things. So they would say that employers, hire workers to the point where their marginal cost is equal to the marginal benefit. They pay them a wage, and they pay them a bundle of benefits, not in the John Paul McDuffie sense. That includes, their work hours, their benefits, their discretion, and that whole bundle together has to be equal to the marginal productivity of hiring one more worker. If not, they're leaving money on the table or they're losing money on that worker. So that's where the equilibrium occurs. And that if you buy into that framework, then the best, or really the only way you can get people into the high road is by increasing their productivity on the margin, either through giving them new skills, introducing new technologies, possibly work redesign, like you gave the example of having home aides do tasks that nurses do. So maybe it comes to some of the same conclusions you do, maybe it's different. One thing that's notably largely absent from that literature is power, and the idea that there's some rents that can be redistributed in different ways, some parts of it, but mostly it has to do with this marginal cost equals marginal benefit equilibrium. So maybe you could comment on that lens that is really dominant among economists, and how it maps onto to your view of what's happening
Sure.
and whether suggestions differ at all if you think of it that way.
And in fairness, dominant among many entrepreneurs and employers.
I'm sorry, I can't hear you. What, say again?
I was just saying, and dominant among many entrepreneurs and employers.
Sure.
too, in terms
So,
of how
so,
they hire
sure.
people.
So, on that's a point of view which is obviously powerful, but it's an argument, it's essentially a little bit Voltairean, we're in the best of all possible worlds. But it's also an argument that's certainly an argument that there's no choice. You know, it's driven by the market and by the kind of technological efficiency frontier and supply and demand and marginal product. This whole argument, everything else we're talking about, is kind of pushes against that and argues that, including the high performance work organization argument, which is if you reorganize work, you could improve people's productivity, or you could get higher quality, or you could get higher performance. And then, if you could do that, it does create rents, and it can be distributed. So I would say that if you're in on the question, it goes to the question of adoption, diffusion. A firm that's in a product market, which is purely a highly competitive product market, for which there's almost no rents, monopoly rents of any kind being generated, would only adopt these kinds of systems if it could reorganize to improve
Right, well,
productivity.
one story might be that there's this
But-
complementarity, so that.
But most of the American economy is not that, right? I mean, there's this old book that shows you how old I am. I actually refer to it all the time, and I've never read it, but don't tell anybody that. Called The Harvest Labor Market. I don't know, it was written in the 1940s, about the labor market for harvest workers in California. The point of the book was to describe what a really purely competitive labor market with no rents would look like, and to contrast it with everything else. So you'd have to make a decision about in the American economy, how much is that, and how much are there rents out there that could be redistributed?
So one of the interesting decisions to be made is, while worker pay is stagnating, executive pay is growing. And are they both following the same marginal cost of productivity side, or do we have two different markets there? Eric, you've done some work on CEO pay and performance companies. Is there good evidence that paying CEOs more actually leads to better company performance?
Logically. So there would be people who have data on both sides.
So one of the choices could be where we allocate that money. whether it's
Sure,
for
those are
workers or
rents.
executives. And then you wouldn't have the organizational issues there.
But no, but the way I interpret your question, Eric, which I think is, under what circumstances are there choices? Clearly, under some circumstances there are choices, but how broad are those circumstances? To what swath of the economy does that refer to?
Well, I'd be more optimistic. I would say even in that extreme case where there's competitive equilibrium and all the employers are hiring workers right up to the marginal cost equals the marginal benefit, and they're paying them wages and whatever, everything that I just said, there's still potentially at least a couple of arguments for advancing a high road strategy. One, sort of trivial, but still maybe important, which is if to the extent the workers get higher productivity, higher skills, they learn something new that they couldn't have done before, or they have a technology they work with that they couldn't have before, or maybe somebody invents a new way of organizing work so that you have fewer nurses or whatever. Any of those things would lead to higher total compensation, and so the prescription would be if you want higher total compensation, look to move those levers that you make the workforce more productive. It all comes down to the workers not going to get more pay or more compensation unless they're more productive.
Sure.
The other, slightly more nuanced one that would be going back to the complementarities one, which would say that in particular this doesn't just happen on a smooth margin, that it could jump quite dramatic, and there may be one equilibrium here and another equilibrium there. So it may be that you sometimes get stuck in a local optimal.
And I would.
But either of those is
No,
certainly neither
right,
classical.
and I want to be
nothing-
respectful in my own thinking and my conversation about the view that there are constraints on what you could do for any given work organization or skill level of the workforce. I don't mean to imply that there aren't standard classic economic constraints. So an old idea in the industrial relations literature is that there's what's called a zone of indeterminacy, within which there's room, but there are boundaries to that zone. So I think from my point of view, the issue is how to, on the one hand, make the case that there's opportunities for choice, but on the other hand, be respectful of what the constraints within which those opportunities take place are.
Yeah, and part of the way of affecting those constraints is that it goes back again to the complementarities. If all you did was leave everything the same and you just paid the worker more, gave them more benefits, whatever, it's likely that the company would start finding that's not very profitable. Because whereas if you said, let's change these other things
Yeah.
simultaneously,
Yeah.
then you're more likely to be able to move to the equilibrium where you can pay more.
Yeah, but you have a problem about the company that chooses to improve the productivity and then not share the benefits.
But will it be that's a separate question, right?
No, I don't think it is. But let's you and then Barbara. Yeah.
So I'm wondering about like outside pressure on companies, like from consumers. Like I will pay more for eggs that I know are humanely raised, and if they're, I wonder if like what you know or what you thought about that mechanism. Like if I knew, if one of the fast food restaurants paid their employees well and had high road
Sure.
jobs, I'd go there.
I think
But
that's a mechanism.
we don't. I feel like we don't know. I don't have a way
Well,
of.
what I do know is that my wife sends me to the supermarket and says I have to get a free range organic egg. I can't stand it.
No, but really, if there was like
No,
some sort
no.
of nutrition label when you're shopping online,
No,
you know, like, but it tells me the
absolutely.
wages, the
There are
benefits,
examples of
they
that.
get
Sure.
grades.
So I mean, you could look at what's happened in international supply chains around sweatshirts and soccer balls, and universities putting pressure on suppliers around child labor. I think those are all mechanisms. I think the only issue about that is the scale at which those mechanisms take place. I teach, in one of the undergraduate courses I teach, I do a class on Walmart. Well, Walmart's kind of complicated, right? I mean, they're definitely low road, at least historically, been definitely low road with respect to their employees. On the other hand, their consumer base really appreciates those lower prices, and so, they provide a real service with respect to efficiencies in supply chains and providing lower prices to their consumer base. I don't know if you could say to that consumer base, are you willing to pay more? I don't know. But so the question is, what are the limits on that? On that? But you're right.
If there was a way to educate consumers so that we could easily look and see grades,
Yeah.
some of us,
Absolutely.
maybe many, maybe.
So my only response, I think that's a completely legitimate strategy. I'm skeptical about the scale of it, but I couldn't give you a research reason or empirical reason why I'm skeptical. I'm just kind of intuitively skeptical, and so I'm subject to the same criticism I've been making of everything else. Barbara?
Just to that point, there is an attempt to do that for consumers as sort of this dual pressure. The organization is called ROC, Restaurant Opportunities Council, and they've identified the qualities of what we call a high road restaurant. And there's information readily available to consumers in cities where they're operating that allows you to make choices about restaurants based on their being good to their employees. And at the same time, they're applying a lot of pressure on the low road restaurants and organizing workers. So they're sort of applying dual pressure, getting information out to consumers, whether they're being, how effective they are, time will tell, but there are emerging organizations like that, kind of outside of the structure of a typical union, but applying pressure in different ways. I'm curious as to why, and we've had this conversation before, but you assume, and I kind of understand why you assume that it's a small number of idiosyncratic, we usually use that term with examples. And is that, we don't really know, examples in healthcare and manufacturing, it wasn't that hard to find, and they weren't kind of fluffy, feel-good companies. So is it more a function of not having the time and resources to do the kind of research that we need to determine whether it's bigger than we think, or, I mean, because it's sort of
Well,
dismissing it as.
No, I'm not, I'm saying the style, Barbara, how many times has Marlin Steel, have you trotted out Marlin Steel? I mean, well, you like Marlin Steel because
I
it's.
trot out 50 others, I mean, it's easy to
Well,
use that one, but we've got, we didn't have any difficulty finding, you know, within a year, about 50 manufacturing companies that kind of fit the profile, so they're mostly private,
Well, okay,
they're
so-
harder to find, but there are 16.
Well, if they're mostly private, that's an important observation.
No, that is.
And so I'm not
Doesn't-
saying
it
they're not,
doesn't-
I'm not, look, I'm not saying they're not there, I'm saying no one has done systematic research.
Right.
And,
That's the
and
problem.
and to the extent that they have relied a little bit on these kinds of best company style lists, about which, at least methodologically, I think we should be pretty skeptical until we've taken a closer look at them.
Yeah.
Yeah?
I'm curious what role organizational structure has in determining adoption, given that if you have organizations that are very hierarchical and there's a large divide between leadership and workers, I think you'd have a very different level of empathy for workers if you're working in a flat organization where you're mixing it up with them and then making determinations of what's good for them or not. So is organizational structure a mechanism for maybe creating more empathy to enable you as leadership to create higher jobs, and at the same time, is there other mechanisms
Yeah.
that organizational
And
structure
before you
can
answer
play?
that, you should know, Devin is the executive producer of the Inclusive Innovation Challenge that is in many ways designed to identify and recognize companies that are doing these kinds of things and using technology.
Uh-huh.
I don't know how familiar you are with it, but
No.
we should get you familiar.
Yeah, I'd
with
like
it.
to know, get me familiar with it, seriously.
Okay.
I think that's a very interesting hypothesis that in real research should be explored. I would say that there is kind of another argument, which is that paternalism and, you know, small kind of patron organized firms in which there's kind of this, they're flat, but there's kind of this tremendous power imbalance, and it's paternalistic and patronish, are problematic. So that's the other side of your interesting hypothesis. And so I think if I were to say a great research project, you know, we do need to understand adoption and diffusion. And so if you were to, in an ideal world, kind of design a research project which you can get any kind of data you wanted to, data on the internal structure and levels and relationships, you know, organizational design, I think would be absolutely data you'd want to have. I think it's a very interesting and powerful hypothesis, truly. Yeah.
So you mentioned this new Good Jobs Institute. Can you just tell us a little bit more about it?
No, go ahead.
So, until the end of this month, I'm still president of the Hitachi Foundation. The foundation has been dedicating its work at this intersection of people and profits, looking at firms from early stage startups all the way through long term, taking a focus on the more traditional firms, on sectors, healthcare, manufacturing, to some extent retail. And so we've decided to close the foundation, but our work isn't finished. So we're spinning off essentially 3 centers or 3 initiatives in 3 different locations to do exactly the kinds of things that Paul's talking about, which is want to help sharpen our understanding of what it means when we say the words quality jobs. But even more importantly, to try to understand how we achieve over time the conditions that enable more with high quality jobs, high road work. And when we talk about it, at least in my mental map, is there's a sort of a firm component, and then there's each of us who are working, and the way in which we work. So this conversation doesn't necessarily include independent work, nor does it have as much of a focus here on startups, but in this sort of broader conceptualizations, what is good work in the 21st century? How do we understand the structure of incentives that enable more of that, or inhibit more of that from occurring? How do we environment in which all of us, well, many of us, particularly people who are more on the sort of vulnerable, feel more confident in their ability to navigate the 21st century labor market, where they will actually be able to have good work, keep food on the table, and move over their head. So how do we begin to structure the research projects that are at this intersection of practice and scholarship, that begin to generate better knowledge that might lead to greater diffusion of good quality jobs? The initiative here will have three primary components. One is practice research, another is teaching, but it'll be through MBA classes, SIP, executive education, and hands-on kinds of conferencing. And third is animating this, making it come alive through a pretty robust communications approach with videos and podcasting and those kinds of things. The concept for this initiative is that it be a connecting force. We don't want to create a large independent center, but to work with IDE, to work with the Sustainability Initiative, to work with the Entrepreneurship Center in ways that can generate something that's greater than the sum of its parts. And similarly, the other two places where this initiative will occur is the Aspen Institute and Investor Circle, which is not as well known, but it's from the work that we've been doing with startups and organization, we have a long-standing relationship. So that's the basic idea of it. We'll tell you more when we actually get started, which is next month. That's the idea.
Other questions or reactions? Yeah.
Do you see any different patterns from other parts of the world, Europe, Asia, and can we learn from that?
Yeah, so, I mean, that's an important question. Yes and no. I mean, one thing to understand is that in the American policy discussion, if you say do it like they do it in France or Scandinavia, people immediately stop listening to you. So I learned that a long time ago when I've done a lot of work over the years on job training programs, and whenever I would say they do it much better in Germany, not me, anyone, you get a lot of pushback. That said, the Russell Sage Foundation sponsored a couple of years ago a very extensive research project on low-wage work in Europe. Did a research volume on each of 5 countries and found quite different patterns for what are classically low-wage jobs in America, how those jobs are treated in other countries. So there's international comparisons certainly make you think that there's scope for choice. It's also true that internationally countries have come under many of the same pressures that we have. So Germany, which has always been seen as a corporatist high road country with high road employment relationships, has vastly expanded the number of part-time, what are called mini jobs, held by, not just by immigrants, but also by Germans, particularly, native Germans, particularly women. And so there's a large low-wage job sector in Germany now that didn't exist when people used to go blah, blah, blah. People like me would go blah, 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 see how they do it in Germany. So the international comparisons are mixed.
I'm afraid we are out of time, but tell us again your book, and it's available on Amazon.
Oh my God, my book that's so sweet of you, will exist in the fall. It's on the Russell Sage fall list. And I just had a harsh conversation this morning with the editor about exactly how long it's going to take to get. So it doesn't exist. It exists in manuscript form, but not in real form. Now, among your circle, you have no respect for the difference between real and virtual.
So we welcome the chance to read
it exists as a bunch of ones and zeros on my computer, but nothing I can hold up and wave around.
All right. Great. So this wraps us up for this semester. If you want to stay engaged with things around the high road inclusive innovation, I mentioned that Devin and the rest of us are all working on the next round of the Inclusive Innovation Challenge, and we look forward to having you come into that. For our seminar in the spring, I think we reconvene, is it on the 8th or I think it's the 8th is what we think. Is it, Susan?
Maybe the first.
Maybe the first of the 8th. Either the 1st or the 8th, which is the first Wednesday of the next semester, depending on how you define first. And we are still, have slots, we're filling in the schedule, so if you have suggestions for speakers you'd like us to invite, please email Susan, David, or me, or all three of us, and we will fill out the rest of the seminar schedule. So thanks, have a great holidays, and we'll see you in February, if not sooner.
Thanks.
Thank you.